On a rain-smashed Thursday morning, when thunder peeled the sky open like a rusty can, a shelter worker found something that should not have existed, a cat with 2 names, 1 life, and a secret bigger than the whole of Sunnyvale County. The metal tag on Benny's collar didn't match the paperwork stacked high in the back office, raising questions no one dared ask in that sleepy town. Dr. David Brooks, a man who had seen too much and trusted too little, made a decision that would unravel the past like an old wool sweater caught on a nail. Hidden beneath Benny's soft purr and innocent green eyes was a mystery stretching 6 long years, touching lives that had sworn they'd moved on. What David uncovered next would rip open old wounds, forge impossible alliances, and reveal a betrayal so deep it would leave everyone gasping for air, wondering, had the real enemy been sitting beside them the whole time? But before we begin, write in the comments where you're from. I'm curious to see how far these stories can travel. And of course, subscribe so you don't miss new captivating tales. Let's begin. Dr. David Brooks never believed in coincidences, not after 30 years of patching up broken strays and watching people break promises even faster than they broke bones. When he picked up Benny that afternoon, feeling the tremor in the cat's tiny body, he noticed something that made the hairs on his arms stand up like soldiers at roll call. The name on Benny's collar was Oliver, but every single file said Benny in thick black ink. Most days at Sunnyvale Animal Center blurred together in the comforting noise of barking dogs, rattling cages, and endless paperwork, but that day sliced through the monotony like a hunting knife through soft cloth. He didn't mention it to the others, didn't trust the small smiles they wore when they told each other that paperwork mistakes happen all the time, because in David's experience, mistakes like these weren't accidents, they were signals. Signals that someone, somewhere, had a story they didn't want told. The storm outside rattled the windows so hard it felt like the whole shelter might lift off and tumble into the clouds, but inside the examination room, it was dead still as David turned the little tag over and over between his fingers. There were scratches around the engraving, deep ones, the kind you don't get from playing in the dirt or chasing butterflies. They looked like someone had tried to carve out the truth and failed. It wasn't the kind of thing most folks would notice, not unless you spent your life looking at the little details that people missed while they were busy lying to themselves about how neat and tidy the world was. He pulled out the old landline, the one they kept for emergencies, and started calling every Maple Creek vet clinic within 50 miles, because he knew in his bones that Benny, or Oliver, or whatever his real name was, didn't just wander into Sunnyvale by mistake. The 4th clinic he called put him on hold for 13 long minutes, and David was about to hang up when a tired voice came on the line and changed the course of everything. Maple Creek Township Veterinary, the woman said, her voice like gravel and broken glass, you said you found a cat with a tag that says Oliver? David answered carefully, choosing each word like a man picking his way across thin ice, because he knew, somehow, he just knew, that he was holding the tip of a thread that could unravel somebody's entire life. The woman asked him to hold, and when she came back, her voice had dropped to a whisper, like she was afraid the walls might overhear her. We lost a cat named Oliver Mitchell 6 years ago, she said, and David felt something cold creep up his spine and settle behind his ribs like a brick of ice. He belonged to Laura Mitchell. Poor woman searched half the county for that cat, said he was her soul in another form. David hung up without saying goodbye, staring down at Benny, who stared back at him with those huge green eyes that looked too wise, too tired, for a cat his age. The next day, David made the drive out to Maple Creek Township himself, rain slashing at his windshield like claws, his gut twisting tighter with every mile. He didn't tell anyone he was going, not the other shelter workers, not even Mary at the front desk who always had a smile and a hot cup of coffee waiting for him. Trust wasn't something you spent lightly in David Brooks' world, and right now, he didn't trust anyone but the rumbling old truck beneath him and the cat tucked into the carrier on the passenger seat. He figured if Benny, or Oliver, really belonged to Laura Mitchell, there'd be a look, a cry, a heartbeat of recognition no amount of years could erase, and if there wasn't, well, then the mystery would just get darker. When he pulled into Laura's driveway, the house looked like something out of a memory, the kind of place you could still smell Sunday dinners and old books through the paint peeling off the porch. Laura Mitchell answered the door in a faded blue sweater, her hands trembling slightly as she brushed a strand of gray hair out of her face, her eyes widening when she saw the cat carrier. Before David could even speak, Benny let out a sound, a small, broken sound, somewhere between a meow and a sob, and launched himself against the door of the carrier so hard it nearly tipped over. Laura fell to her knees right there on the porch, reaching through the bars, her voice cracking like dry timber in a firestorm, calling one name over and over again, Oliver. Oliver. Oliver, my sweet boy. David stood there in the rain, feeling the weight of something bigger than himself settle onto his shoulders, like he was just a messenger for a story that had started long before he got involved. He opened the carrier door, and Benny, no, Oliver, bolted into Laura's arms with a force that would have knocked down a bigger woman, but she held him tight, weeping into his fur like she'd finally found a part of herself she thought was gone forever. For a long time, David just watched, the storm soaking him to the bone, feeling like an intruder on a private resurrection. He thought the story might end there, with joy and tears and the kind of miracle people didn't believe in anymore, but as he turned to leave, a battered sedan pulled up behind his truck, and another woman stepped out into the rain. She was older, thin as a fence post, with eyes like burned-out stars and a limp that spoke of old battles she didn't like to talk about. She clutched a worn photo to her chest, and when she spoke, her voice was a whip crack across the soaked air. "That's my cat," she said, pointing at Benny, at Oliver, her face carved out of grief and rage in equal measure. "My Benny, you found my Benny." And just like that, David realized the story was nowhere near over. It had only just begun. For one long, terrible moment, the only sound in the world was the hammering of the rain against the cracked concrete, the beating of two hearts who both believed they had found something they thought was lost forever. Laura Mitchell stood frozen, still clutching Oliver, or Benny, against her chest like a drowning woman clutches driftwood, her mouth working soundlessly as she tried to process what she had just heard. Across the narrow strip of soggy earth, Martha Ellis, thin and weathered, held out the photograph with a shaking hand, her lips trembling with a fury born of 6 bitter years of waiting and hoping. The photo was old, dog-eared at the corners, showing a young tabby kitten perched proudly on a windowsill, its green eyes identical to the ones peering out from Laura's trembling arms. David Brooks, still standing there in the rain like some ghost caught between two worlds, felt the storm outside sink straight into his bones, because he knew there were no clean endings where lost things were concerned. Martha Ellis stepped closer, her shoes squelching in the mud, her voice rising above the howling wind, accusing and desperate all at once, painting Laura as a thief without using the word. She said she had adopted Benny from a shelter across the state line after a highway accident had separated her from her late husband, claiming Benny was all she had left in the world when death and disaster stripped her life bare. She described a scratch behind Benny's right ear, a little notch in his tail, a way he purred not like a motor but like a broken harmonica, and with every detail she revealed, David watched Laura's face fall one shade paler. Laura, who had spent years sewing Oliver's little toys by hand, building shelves by the window so he could sit in the sun, insisting to everyone who told her to move on that someday, he would come home. And there stood Martha, equally broken, equally fierce, equally certain that fate had finally swung back in her favor and brought Benny, her Benny, back to her door. David didn't know whether it was pity, rage, or something older and darker that made him step between them, one hand raised like a traffic cop in a town without laws, but he knew he couldn't let this moment tear two already broken souls into bloody pieces. He suggested, carefully, cautiously, that maybe, just maybe, there was some kind of mistake, that maybe they could sit down together, share what they knew, and find out who Benny truly belonged to without tearing each other apart. At first, Laura looked like she wanted to fight it, to cling to Oliver and slam the door on the world and pretend this new pain didn't exist, but something in Martha's hollow eyes stopped her cold. Maybe Laura saw in Martha what David saw, a woman too tired to lie, too wounded to invent a story, too desperate to steal. And so, trembling like leaves about to fall, the three of them stepped inside Laura's house, where the air smelled of cedar and old sorrows, and sat down to tell each other their side of the story. For hours they talked, swapping memories like trading cards, each detail layering a complicated tapestry that made it harder and harder to untangle the truth from the grief. Benny, or Oliver, it was getting harder to call him anything without feeling a sting of guilt, curled up first on Laura's lap, then later patted across the floor and nudged his head against Martha's knee, purring with the strange, broken rhythm she had described. David watched carefully, feeling the weight of judgment settle on him, because somehow he had become the deciding voice in a story that should have been the province of fate alone. By nightfall, they were no closer to an answer than they had been on the porch, but something had changed, something fragile and glistening like a spider's web in the rain. Instead of fighting, the two women began sharing quiet stories about lonely winters, silent dinners, long nights spent staring out windows that never seemed to brighten with hope. It was Laura who finally broke the silence, her voice soft but steady, suggesting a solution so simple it was almost heresy in a world obsessed with ownership and lines drawn in sand. "Maybe he doesn't have to belong to just one of us," she said, stroking the cat's matted fur with a hand so gentle it might have been carving forgiveness right into his skin. "Maybe," she said, "he could live two lives at once, traveling between their homes like an old ghost who refuses to choose one grave." At first, Martha laughed, a rough, broken sound that spoke of disbelief and heartbreak tangled together, but after a long pause, she nodded, wiping at her eyes with the sleeve of her worn-out coat. And David, feeling something deep inside his old heart loosen and let go, realized he was witnessing a kind of resurrection not even the finest preacher could have conjured up on Easter Sunday. Arrangements were made with a solemnity usually reserved for funerals. Benny would spend 3 months with Laura, then 3 months with Martha, shuttled back and forth with David as the reluctant, grumbling ferryman. They agreed to share vet bills, to coordinate birthdays and holidays, to send photos and stories back and forth like two parents who'd found each other too late but still refused to let go of their miracle. Outside, the storm finally spent itself into a drizzle, the clouds parting just enough to let a few reluctant stars peek through, as if even the heavens wanted to see how this strange, stitched-together family would fare. David thought maybe, just maybe, this was one of those rare moments when the world bent in favor of mercy instead of cruelty, when broken things didn't have to stay broken forever. But just as he was gathering his coat and preparing to leave, just as he thought the story was folding itself into a neat, hopeful ending, Martha's phone rang with a sound like a crow's scream, and everything, changed again. She answered it with trembling fingers, listening for a long moment, the color draining from her face so fast David thought she might topple from her chair. When she hung up, she turned to Laura and David with eyes so haunted they didn't look like they belonged to a living woman anymore. "The man who found Benny 6 years ago," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper, "he's back. And he's looking for him." And just like that, the real danger stepped out of the shadows, grinning like a wolf at the door. There are some phone calls a man spends a lifetime hoping never to receive, and as David watched Martha's face crumple in on itself, he knew this was one of them. She clutched the old cell phone so tightly it seemed it might shatter between her fingers, her knuckles widening with the strain of holding back whatever storm was gathering behind her eyes. Laura instinctively drew Oliver, or Benny, closer against her chest, her body shielding the cat with the kind of fierce, primal protectiveness you only ever saw in two creatures, mothers and survivors. The air in the room thickened until it felt like breathing soup, and David took one slow step forward, careful not to break the fragile thread of sanity that still barely held them together. "Who called you?" he asked, his voice low, the old gravel and thunder rolling through it, but Martha only shook her head, whispering a name that chilled David's blood colder than the rain outside. "Mr. Granger," she said, her voice cracking like ice underfoot, a name that meant nothing to Laura but made David's stomach twist with a deep, nameless dread. He remembered now, half-whispered rumors, stray mentions in vet circles, about a man who had once run a rescue operation that trafficked animals not to homes, but to laboratories and underground trades where no creature ever came back whole. The story had been brushed aside, hidden under polite smiles and sealed police files, because in small towns, monsters didn't live under beds, they lived in houses with porches and mailboxes like everybody else. If this Mr. Granger was sniffing around now, 6 years after Benny's disappearance, it meant the old ghosts weren't finished haunting Sunnyvale and Maple Creek just yet. And somehow, without realizing it, David, Laura, and Martha had walked straight back into the lair of a man who didn't believe in letting anything, or anyone, go once he'd laid claim to them. Before they could speak again, headlights slashed across the windows, bright and blinding, casting twisted shadows across the living room walls like monsters clawing their way inside. The battered blue truck idling outside was familiar in the worst way possible, its dented bumper and rust-bitten side screaming of long highways and long-forgotten crimes. David grabbed his coat off the back of the chair with one hand and the old fireplace poker with the other, because a man doesn't survive as long as he had without knowing when talking's done and fighting's about to begin. Martha stood up shakily, her body trembling like a wind-battered tree but her face settling into a grim mask of resolution, as if she'd been waiting for this confrontation longer than she dared admit aloud. Laura didn't move at first, torn between her instincts to run and the knowledge that no amount of locked doors or boarded windows would stop what was coming. The knock when it came wasn't polite or hesitant, it was the kind of knock that demands entry, the kind that assumes ownership even before the door swings open. David motioned for the women to stay back, stepping toward the door with the poker hidden behind his leg, his body coiled tight and ready for whatever lay on the other side. When he opened it, Mr. Granger stood there smiling, a smile that didn't touch his eyes, a smile that looked carved from stone and venom in equal measure. He was taller than David remembered from the old photo clippings, his hair gone mostly silver, but the cruelty leaking from his bones was unmistakably intact and stronger than ever. He wore the kind of cheap jacket you buy at a gas station and a pair of worn boots that had trampled better men into dust, and when he spoke, his voice was all honey and hidden knives. "Evening, folks," Granger drawled, tilting his head in mock courtesy, his gaze sliding over them like a butcher sizing up livestock before the cleaver fell. "I hear tell there's been a little mix-up with a cat that belongs to me," he continued, as if he were discussing the weather instead of threatening to shatter the fragile lives inside the room. David stepped forward without hesitation, blocking the doorway with his frame, feeling the poker grow warm in his grip as the old fire inside him stirred to life. "This cat," David said, his voice like a low rumble rolling up from the earth itself, "belongs to nobody but himself, and he damn sure doesn't belong to you." Granger chuckled then, a slow, mean sound that dripped with the certainty of a man who believed the world owed him whatever he could take with his two filthy hands. "I've got paperwork," Granger said, pulling a folded sheaf of documents from his coat pocket with a flourish, as if that one act could erase 6 years of suffering and blood and tears. The papers were slick with moisture, stamped and signed in ways that looked real enough to fool a judge or a sheriff too lazy to dig deeper, but David didn't even glance at them. He knew men like Granger didn't come for what was rightfully theirs, they came for what they thought no one was strong enough to defend. Behind him, he heard Laura's soft gasp and the shifting of Martha's feet as she braced herself, and he realized that whatever happened next wasn't going to be about law or papers. It was going to be about willpower, about standing in the storm without blinking, about protecting the small, fragile light they had fought so hard to rekindle. Granger took one step forward, expecting David to flinch, to yield, to step aside like so many others had over the years, but David Brooks had never been the yielding kind. He braced his shoulders, feeling every scar, every bad night, every loss harden into armor around his battered heart, and stared Granger down with a gaze that said plainly, "You'll have to go through me first." The standoff stretched long enough for the rain to change from drizzle to steady sheets again, each drop hammering against the roof like a war drum growing louder by the second. Finally, with a snarl that peeled back the last of his fake civility, Granger shoved the papers into David's chest hard enough to knock him back a step, then turned and stalked back toward his truck. But as he climbed inside and peeled away into the night, his tires spitting gravel like shrapnel, David knew in his bones that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Because men like Granger didn't ask twice. They came back when you least expected it. And they never came alone. Inside the house, as Laura and Martha huddled close, David glanced down at the damp papers still clutched in his fist, and saw something that made his heart drop like a stone. There, hidden among the legal jargon and counterfeit signatures, was a name he recognized. A name he trusted. A name of someone who had smiled at him, laughed with him, helped him rescue dozens of animals over the years. Mary. The sweet, smiling woman at the shelter's front desk. The one who always had a hot coffee waiting for him. Her signature was right there, under the line marked, "Witness." And just like that, David realized that the real enemy hadn't been standing at the door tonight. The real enemy had been standing right beside him all along. There are betrayals in a man's life that come fast and violent, like a punch to the mouth on a dark street corner, but the worst betrayals, the ones that leave scars no doctor can ever stitch shut, come slow and smiling, wearing the faces of people you trusted with the last soft parts of your soul. As David stood there in Laura's small living room, rain pounding the windows like fists, staring at Mary's name scrawled across the fake adoption papers, he felt something deep inside him, something good and old, snap clean in half. He could still hear her voice in his head, soft and easy like molasses, telling him how good he was with animals, how lucky Sunnyvale was to have a man like him, how the world needed more hearts like his, all while signing her name on papers that would sell a creature like Benny to the highest bidder. Martha, sensing the change in him before he could find the words to explain it, came to his side and read the papers over his shoulder, her sharp intake of breath telling David she saw the same cold truth blooming like mold across their fragile hopes. Laura sat frozen on the couch, cradling Benny, her face turned toward the darkened window where Granger's taillights had long since vanished, her mind surely replaying every small kindness, every warm greeting, every comforting lie that Mary had fed them all along. David paced the room with slow, deliberate steps, the poker still in his hand, the weight of it comforting but useless against the kind of war they were now facing. He knew Granger would not stop, not with legal tricks or counterfeit claims or whispered threats. Men like that only understood two languages, force and fear, and David was a speaker of both when the situation demanded it. But it wasn't just Granger he had to worry about now, it was Mary, still sitting behind the desk at Sunnyvale Animal Center, smiling at visitors, placing gentle hands on new arrivals, all while funneling the ones she deemed valuable into dark places no one dared speak of aloud. The betrayal cut even deeper because David had defended her once, loudly and publicly, when others had whispered concerns about the growing number of animals being transferred without explanation or records, dismissing them as bitter gossip from people who hadn't seen the kindness he thought he knew so well. And now the price of his blind loyalty wasn't just a broken heart, it was a small, battered cat sleeping in Laura's lap, unaware that wolves had been circling him for years, biding their time. Martha, never one for wasted breath, asked the question that had been hanging in the air between them like a noose: what did they do now? David didn't answer immediately because the truth was, he didn't know. Every part of him screamed for action, for justice, for the kind of righteous fury that could burn a place like Sunnyvale Animal Center to the ground, but experience had taught him that smart fights save lives and dumb fights bury the innocent. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and steady, telling them that they couldn't go to the police, not yet, not until they had something more concrete than forged papers and long memories. Men like Granger and women like Mary covered their tracks too well to be brought down by accusations alone. They needed proof, undeniable, inescapable proof that would shine a light so bright even the darkest corners of Sunnyvale and Maple Creek couldn't hide the filth squirming there. And they needed to move fast, because if Granger had dared to show his face at Laura's house tonight, it meant he was already certain of one thing: somewhere, somehow, Benny had become too valuable to let go. David proposed a plan that tasted like copper and desperation in his mouth, a plan that would require every ounce of cunning, strength, and luck they had left. He would return to Sunnyvale Animal Center the next morning, just like any other weary, world-sick vet reporting for duty, masking the fire inside him behind a smile as false as Mary's own. He would dig into the records when no one was looking, find the real files hidden behind the fakes, uncover the names, the routes, the buyers, anything that could tie Mary and Granger together so tightly not even the slickest lawyer could pry them apart. Meanwhile, Laura and Martha would stay hidden at Laura's house, taking turns watching over Benny like sentries guarding a king, prepared to move at a moment's notice if Granger came creeping back through the trees. It wasn't much of a plan, and it wasn't safe by any stretch of the imagination, but it was all they had left standing between them and the open, merciless jaws of a machine that swallowed creatures whole and spit out nothing but sorrow. As the clock ticked toward midnight, Laura finally found her voice again, asking the question David had been dreading more than any other: what if Mary saw through him? David smiled then, a small, broken smile that tasted of old wars and older wounds, telling her not to worry, because he had spent a lifetime being underestimated by people who thought kindness was the same thing as weakness. He promised them both that if Mary or Granger or any other devils lurking behind their painted-on grins tried to take Benny again, they would have to come through him first, and this time, there would be no second chances, no civil conversations, no looking the other way. As Laura locked the doors and drew the curtains, as Martha set up a makeshift bed by the front door with a worn-out shotgun resting across her lap, David stared out into the night and felt something old and dangerous stirring inside him, something he had hoped he'd never have to awaken again. It was the part of him that had buried friends in foreign dirt, that had stitched up dogs too broken for hope, that had fought back against the darkness when everyone else said it was too late. He went to his truck, climbed inside, and rested his forehead against the steering wheel, breathing in the old leather and dust, steeling himself for the morning. As he closed his eyes, a memory surfaced, unbidden and sharp, of Mary smiling up at him that first day he'd come to Sunnyvale, handing him a clipboard and a cup of coffee, telling him he was just the kind of man they needed around here. He remembered how proud he'd felt, how hungry he had been for a place to belong, and how easily he had let himself believe that kindness could exist without shadows creeping behind it. Tomorrow, he would go back into the lion's den, armed with nothing but a weathered smile and the hard, unbreakable truth burning in his gut like a slow, relentless fire. Tomorrow, he would find out just how deep the rot at Sunnyvale ran, and whether any part of it could still be saved. As the first thin light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, painting the rain-slick streets in shades of tarnished gold, David opened his eyes, started the engine, and drove back toward the place where it had all begun. And behind him, in the small house tucked between the trees, 2 women and a battered cat kept vigil, waiting for the storm to break, or swallow them whole. Morning in Sunnyvale always had a way of pretending things were better than they were, as if a fresh coat of sunlight could hide the rust eating through the bones of the town. David Brooks pulled into the cracked asphalt lot of Sunnyvale Animal Center, his truck coughing a tired protest, the old building squatting there like a worn-out dog too mean to die. The place looked the same as always, flaking paint, a sagging roofline, the faded banner out front boasting, "Forever homes for all God's creatures," like some kind of cruel, private joke. David sat there for a long minute, one hand on the ignition, feeling every old scar inside him throb like warning bells, telling him this might be the last time he ever walked through that door as an honest man. Then, with a slow breath that tasted like dust and old regrets, he stepped out into the cold morning air and walked toward the building with the steady tread of a man walking into battle. Inside, the world was a lie of cheerful posters and bright paint, the sickly sweet smell of disinfectant doing its best to cover the older, uglier smells lurking underneath. Mary looked up from the front desk with that same easy smile that had fooled him for so many years, her voice sugar-sweet as she chirped out a greeting, asking if he wanted his usual coffee. David nodded, playing the part, letting her believe she still held the cards, while inside, he filed away every twitch, every glance, every small tremor in her hand as she slid the paper cup across the counter. He accepted it with a grunt, sipped, and let the bitter taste roll across his tongue like a bad memory, before making some excuse about double-checking the intake logs from last month, knowing full well she'd never say no to him. Mary smiled again, but this time David saw the stiffness around her eyes, the way her fingers tapped a nervous rhythm against the desk, and he knew without a shred of doubt, she was expecting trouble, and she was ready for it. He made his way down the narrow hall, past rows of cages and wide, sorrowful eyes peeking out from the bars, every step heavier than the last. The record room was locked, of course, but David had stolen keys before in worse places under worse circumstances, and this lock gave up its secrets as easily as an old drunk at a lonely bar. Inside, the air was stale and thick with the smell of old paper and secrets long hidden away, filing cabinets lined up like gravestones in a forgotten cemetery. David worked quickly, pulling files, scanning records, looking for anything that could tie Mary to Granger in a way no lawyer could wiggle out from under. It wasn't long before he found it, a transfer sheet, stamped and signed, with Benny's old ID number scratched out and replaced with a code that led to a private sanctuary address, Granger's Sanctuary, hidden under a different name. The deeper he dug, the uglier the truth became. dozens of animals, maybe hundreds, rerouted through fake addresses, laundered like dirty money, sold off to places too dark for the good people of Sunnyvale to imagine even in their worst nightmares. And every single one of them, every lost dog, every vanished cat, had Mary's neat, looping signature tying them straight to Granger's bloody doorstep. David knew then that it wasn't about money alone, it was about control, about feeding an appetite for power over helpless things, the worst kind of hunger a human soul could ever grow. He gathered what he could, stuffing papers into his jacket, memorizing names and dates, knowing he'd need more than just stolen documents to bring this whole rotten house crashing down. He needed a confession, raw, undeniable, preferably caught on tape, the kind that made even the most stubborn small-town sheriff sit up and listen. As he turned to leave, the heavy thud of boots behind him froze the breath in his lungs, and he knew, before he even turned around, that he wasn't going to make it out of here clean. Granger stood in the doorway, a butcher's grin splitting his face, his arms crossed like a man waiting to collect a debt long overdue. David moved fast, lunging sideways, but Granger was faster, or maybe just more desperate, and the two men crashed into the filing cabinets with a noise like a thunderclap. David fought dirty, fought like a man who knows there are no fair fights worth winning, but Granger was bigger, meaner, and high on the certainty that the world would never punish men like him. The struggle spilled into the hallway, papers flying like broken wings, and somewhere in the chaos, David caught a glimpse of Mary standing at the end of the corridor, watching it all with cold, empty eyes. For a split second, David thought she might step in, might choose decency over the long road of wrong she had walked so confidently. But then Mary reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a small black phone, dialing quickly, her voice calm and sweet as she said, "Yes, Sheriff. We have a break-in at Sunnyvale, send units now." It was all a setup, from the moment he'd walked in the door, a spider's web strung tight around him, waiting for him to thrash himself helpless. David knew if the deputies rolled up and found him with stolen files and a busted door, no amount of truth would save him from spending the next 20 years rotting behind bars while Benny disappeared forever into the dark. He did the only thing a man in his position could do, he ran. He crashed through the emergency exit, setting off alarms that howled like banshees into the morning air, sprinting toward his truck with every ounce of strength left in his aging body. Shots rang out, warning shots, for now, but David didn't look back, didn't waste time wondering how far Mary and Granger would go to keep their empire intact. He roared onto the highway, tires screeching, blood pounding so loud in his ears he couldn't hear the sirens yet, but he knew they were coming, rising like a tidal wave behind him. As he drove, he thought of Laura, of Martha, of the small, battered cat curled up in a patch of sunlight on Laura's kitchen floor, unaware that the whole world was balancing on the razor's edge of what David did next. He thought of the betrayal, the lies, the broken trust, and the deep, terrible truth that sometimes the monsters we fear most aren't hiding in the dark, they're hiding in plain sight, wearing our smiles. David didn't go home. He didn't run to the police. He didn't even run to Laura's place, knowing that would be the first door they kicked in once they realized he wasn't going to quietly disappear. Instead, he did something no one expected. He drove straight into town square, parked his battered truck in front of the courthouse, and walked inside carrying every stolen paper, every shredded piece of evidence, and the bloody truth dripping from his hands. He didn't plead or beg or bargain. He laid it all out on the desk of the county judge, a grizzled old man who remembered David's father and grandfather, and knew the weight of a Brooks word when it was spoken plainly. The scandal broke like a dam giving way after too much rain, washing Mary, Granger, and half the Sunnyvale City Council right out of their comfortable little holes. There were arrests, hearings, tearful confessions splattered across the news, and quiet, shameful retirements from men and women who should have known better but chose not to. Benny, or Oliver, or whatever you chose to call the little survivor, lived out his days traveling between two homes, loved more fiercely than most creatures could dream of in their wildest sleeps. Laura and Martha became something strange and beautiful, not enemies, not exactly friends, but bonded by the strange, sacred burden of a shared heart. And David Brooks, old and battered, never did go back to working at Sunnyvale, because some places, once spoiled, can never be made clean again, no matter how many coats of paint you slap over the rot. Instead, he opened a little clinic on the edge of town, no fancy signs, no banners, just a battered shingle swinging in the wind and a reputation strong enough to keep the right kind of people coming. When he thought about it, late at night, sitting on his porch with the stars stretched overhead, David didn't blame Mary as much as he thought he would. In the end, she hadn't betrayed him because she hated him. She had betrayed him because she believed she would never get caught. And that, David knew, was the oldest and saddest betrayal of all. Write in the comments where you're from. Let's see how far these stories can spread. And of course, subscribe so you don't miss new exciting stories. See you soon.